So, Prof, thank you very much. That's a very kind introduction. And as Ian says, the title that I now hold is one that is a little bit of a strange description of a responsibility for an organization that today spans the world. Came into existence in the 1960s as part of the expression of solidarity, engagement, and support of the United Nations to the developing world, and employs 17,000 people across the world, working in 170 countries with roughly $5 billion that are available to us to be able to invest in the ideas of tomorrow that need to be experimented with and introduced today. So joining you here in Singapore is not only a great pleasure, it's also a wonderful way in which to ground truth my perception of what is happening around us and the world in which we are trying to act, because the discussions that, particularly in the world of business in Asia and the Pacific, have often been a kind of bellwether of what is actually likely to drive thinking in the world of business, of finance, of investment next, and it has done so for a number of years, partly because the dynamism of this region, but also because increasingly in Asia, I sense that new pathways are being explored that are not divergent necessarily, but different in nuance and emphasis and also in perception from what traditionally has been a sustainability agenda and sustainable development agenda, often associated more with the byproduct of the industrialized world trying to correct for the costs, the mistakes, and the challenges that a 20th century approach to development have created. I think it is no accident that it is in this region that concepts about the future are now being discussed that transcend the traditional view of economic development, that resonate to the concept of sustainable development, that easily relate to this 17-goal framework that we refer to as the Sustainable Development Goals, and whether it is the sufficiency economy in Thailand, whether it is gross national happiness in Bhutan, whether it is the concept of ecological civilization in China, all of these are giving expression to both a narrative and a new direction in thinking about development that is genuinely emerging out of the experience here in Asia. We live in a time of extraordinary opportunity and transformation. And I would like to focus in my remarks this morning really on this concept of transformation, because it is both the imperative to act and the opportunity to act that are converging in ways that I think, particularly from a business perspective, are essential to thinking about the future. The imperative to act has just been brought into focus again by the IPCC that last weekend released its latest report. Now, as Malcolm said, I have had a great deal of attention as part of my professional life on the whole issue of climate change, its implications, and out of that arose a great deal of the work around this notion of a transition towards a green economy, an inclusive green economy as a way of thinking about the future. But I must say, despite having read a great deal about what is happening, this last IPCC report at first didn't surprise me in terms of the headline. But when I started reading it, it actually was profoundly disturbing. If you take the world's scientists, and let me just for the record say again, this is 99.5% of the world's scientists that have reviewed about 60,000 of the latest scientific research papers in the world in order to arrive at this report that sought to answer the question as to whether the world can still realistically meet the objective of staying within a 1.5 degree warming scenario in the future. Read this report between the lines, it basically tells you that in a physical and chemistry sense, yes, it still could, but frankly speaking, we've probably passed the point of no return. Just dwell on that for a moment. Imagine that much of what the science is telling us, and also the scenarios that the IPCC and the economists and the environmental scientists and atmospheric scientists have projected forward. Imagine if just half of what they say will happen as a result of that point of no return having been passed. Then imagine what our world will look like, and imagine what perhaps our children or grandchildren one day will be debating on a TV show when they are asked, how on earth did our parents or grandparents not act when they knew all of this, and they knew that we would never ever have a choice to reverse this in our lifetime? Because this is essentially what this latest report tells us. We have now essentially gone through that window of opportunity and we didn't seize it. The report still says in theory doable, but it would be so disruptive to try and maintain a pace of change that would allow us to stay within the 1.5 degree warming scenario that by virtually everybody's pragmatic account, this is no longer realistic. But the report is actually far worse in what it is telling us. It's not only telling us, look, there is another 10 years in which theoretically the world could do something about 1.5, but actually on the current trajectory of what we're doing, we're not only heading beyond 1.5 to 2.5, we're actually hurtling towards a 3-degree world of warming. This is a scenario that in part I think the world is still struggling to understand because it is so disruptive, it is so transformational, that much of what we consider to be the givens in our world, and particularly you who work in the world of business, often have to rely on the givens, that you can virtually throw every scenario about your business, your future markets, your supply chains out of the window, because by 2050, we will have a world in which many of the fundamental assumptions simply no longer hold. I won't go on about this, but I just wanted to use this latest report to explain to you when I say the imperative to change is becoming ever more clear, and it is not a matter of whether you like it or you don't like it, you believe in it or you don't believe in it. If you are a business person, there is no alternative but to look at these drivers and ask yourself, what do they actually imply for my business over the next 10 or 20 years? If you obviously only think in 6-month horizons, maybe a lot of this is irrelevant, but many of you in this room wouldn't be here if that was your time horizon. But the imperative goes beyond that, whether it is the supply chains, whether it is plastics in the oceans, whether it is the loss of biodiversity. The simple fact that we are going to be 10 billion people in about 30 to 40 years' time, 9 to 10 billion people, and at the very moment in which we have to still figure out how we're going to feed ourselves, every year we have a net loss of arable land because of the way that we use land. Now, anybody who would sit in a sort of risk scenario room and say you need to do something about this would be putting on the yellow and red lights. And yet, still we are struggling to adjust our agricultural economies around the world to moving towards a more sustainable farming model. Not to mention the constraints in terms of water supplies. Much of that increased food production assumes intensification on all fronts of technology, including water use. Already 70% of non-salt water use in the world is agriculture. And many of the areas where we think we can still expand agriculture and food production happen to be either arid, semi-arid, or certainly areas where you need more than just rainfall to grow food on an industrial scale. So again, feeding ourselves, the most basic element of a global economy to function, is another stress factor. So the imperative to act is becoming one of a defining nature. But alongside that is the good side of all of this, the opportunity to act. It is remarkable how the discussion about climate change evolved over a 20-year period, essentially, 20 to 25-year period, from being a science fiction scenario that nobody really took seriously, to emerging as a kind of, well, this may be true, but what are we going to do? We're a fossil fuel-based world. We cannot change. We cannot decouple economic growth from emissions, and the kinds of demands scientists are making are simply unrealistic. So just 25 years later, having as a result in part of climate change given birth to an energy revolution that already for 4 to 5 years running now has resulted in terms of new electricity generating infrastructure with renewables exceeding the combined total annually in terms of investments of oil, gas, coal and nuclear combined. In just 20 years, from a science fiction theory about climate change to fundamentally shaping and influencing the energy markets of the world, to giving rise to entirely new economies such as renewable energy, electric mobility, the urban smart city. Listening to Ian just now, 20 years ago, would you have stood here and said, one of the things we are proud of is how we are sourcing from our supply chains, that we are recollecting and harvesting 60,000 liters of water from our air conditioning system, that we're reducing 30%, I think you said, of our emissions. No, those were not parameters for management. Today they are, and tomorrow they will be the defining ones. So in standing here before you today, I want to, in a sense, impress upon you how much we look to you as leaders in business to not be spectators to the larger drama of sustainable development that is playing out in the world. In fact, you are the central players. Whether you take GDP statistics and the fact that mostly in the world, public budgets of governments rarely exceed 20 to 25% of GDP, which means that 3/4 of the economy is transacted through the decisions that you take, not to mention employment and technology development. In large part, the response to this imperative and the seizing of the opportunity actually rests in the hands of business. Not that government has no role to play, on the contrary, smart regulation, incentives, fiscal policies, subsidies, technology promotion, accelerating the markets of tomorrow in today's economy. All of this is significant, but it is the context. It is people like yourselves who look at this future world and take responsibility for shaping it with the kinds of powers of ingenuity, of financial capital, of creativity, of the ability to understand how markets can become part of the solution rather than being part of the problem. It is to you that I personally, and I think the world increasingly also today, is looking to offer leadership. The opportunities are clear because we have many examples in the world today where bold business leadership in this domain is actually not that different from what the basic DNA of business success has always been. Recognizing an opportunity, bringing entrepreneurial ingenuity into a market opportunity, seizing technologies, convincing investors. And I often like to cite the example of IKEA, because I found one decision, I mean, IKEA does many things, but one decision very inspiring. In the lead up to Paris, IKEA took the decision to stop selling traditional light bulbs. It just said, no, we're not going to sell them anymore. In terms of the business strategy, many inside IKEA thought this was an extremely dangerous decision because selling light bulbs, oddly enough, is quite an important part of IKEA's business. But they took the decision to, from there on, only sell energy-efficient lighting technology. And it was a decision that was taken, and overnight, the entire IKEA global outlets chain only sold efficient energy light bulbs. They were more expensive initially, but because of the scale, they actually could offer them cheaper than most others. And it was a decision that is not about putting a few solar panels on your roof, which IKEA has also done. I think they have committed to having 100% renewable energy supplies in the near future, as have many other corporations. But it was going to the core of its business and saying, we want to make our business part of the business of society of addressing sustainable development objectives. And there are many others here. We were just talking with the chairman of April also about some of the decisions taken in terms of its production systems and supply chains, and how a company can, yes, be part of using and exploiting natural resources, but also reinvesting in maintaining the resilience and viability of that natural resource base. Many of you in this room here would not be here if you're not working on those issues. And so let me tell you, I encourage you to be bold. Take it personally, because we are beyond the age of CSR in the sense of responding to the imperative and seizing the opportunities. CSR will remain relevant. It's a basic way in which a business takes responsibility in its community, perhaps in the context in which it works, in the market in which it operates. But what I'm proposing to you is that the Sustainable Development Goals are not something that you need to, in a sense, carry around with you and be able to recite all 17 off by heart to prove that you believe in sustainable development. They're also not a formula, but they are a remarkable framework that in one strange way or another emerged in 2015 as a way in which the world said, if we do not come together and address these 17 issues collectively, that's why they're also universal goals. They're no longer the goals for development in developing countries. These are goals that a nation such as Germany or the United States or Japan have committed to actually addressing, notwithstanding political interruptions along the way, that will define the way countries work with one another. They have become a framework through which to look at the future. And interesting enough, in the private sector world of finance, of insurance, of consumer goods, but also of natural resources, the food industry. These goals have become a framework to look at the future. They are a prism through which to understand what are the likely factors that will shape the markets of tomorrow, the business environment in which we will operate, the differentiating criteria that markets and consumers will use to judge our product, our footprint, our contribution. You all know that we are moving rapidly into an age where every single decision in your business will become part of public record. And so public that indeed you walk along your supermarket shelf with your smartphone, look at a product, and you can get the energy footprint, you can get an idea whether the company has a carbon neutral policy in place, and whether you will buy this product because you think you're actually helping rather than making the world more difficult to manage. This is the future of consumption. It is also the future of production. It's the future of our economies. And so using the SDGs right now is not a sort of catechism to which you commit in a sort of almost religious sense. No, on the contrary. By all means, begin by using an individual goal and relate it to what you do today. But the idea is not only to link your business to one or two goals, because the whole point of sustainable development is to embrace the notion and the challenge of managing systems and complexities. In business, you know this because you have supply chains, you have your own production sites, and you have your customer and markets. You manage not only a set of production steps, you actually manage systems. Now, extrapolate from that for a moment the system we have to manage to feed 10 billion people. A system to manage in which by 2050 we essentially no longer emit carbon dioxide. A system in which we are losing much of our biodiversity to the extent that there will be more plastic in the oceans by 2050 than there are fish. And just to give you a few examples. On the back of this, however, emerge extraordinary opportunities for transformation. I mentioned mobility, electric mobility, or other low-emission forms of it. In fact, the whole concept of mobility will change over the next few years. We've already seen it in areas such as public transport and taxi services. The Uber example and the many other similar operations that are emerging, hotel rooms. Imagine what the future of transport will look like 20 to 30 years from now. A recent study by the OECD of the capital city of Portugal looked at an internodal managed transport system where no longer people would own cars, but there would be vehicles picking you up from your house, bringing you to the nodes where you could catch buses, smaller buses, passing through your neighborhood, connect to the trains. You could have the entire population of Lisbon move around the city faster with 20% of the vehicles on the street. Now, those of you who live in big cities around the world know that much of our urban transport system is today the exact opposite. It's standing in traffic jams, it's creating pollution problems of an extraordinary magnitude, and therefore the problem of climate change suddenly becomes part of the solution to a new form of mobility, new technologies, new markets that emerge. We can reinvent our economy, and this is precisely what I would like to suggest to you. The next 20 to 30 years are going to be profoundly disruptive, and transformational. And this is not only in the private sector, it is also for the public sector. Governments are confronted with challenges of rethinking the economy of employment, of education, of public service in ways that they have not had to do so for 100 years. The advent of, whether you call it the fourth industrial revolution, the digital economy, automation, artificial intelligence, has already begun to change what will happen next at a pace that is extraordinary. And perhaps something we have not realized, the advent of artificial intelligence and all that it, in a sense, implies as next generation opportunities, technologies, for the first time in human history, will literally touch every citizen, every economy, every country, every market of the world simultaneously. This has never happened before. I mention this because in Asia, but also particularly for a continent like Africa, 1.2 billion people soon, 2 billion people by the middle of this century, the question will be, how do you develop your economy? Because the Asian model simply is not going to work for Africa. Automation, the digital economy, artificial intelligence may bring manufacturing and service industries to Africa, but it may well produce 5 to 6% of GDP growth with zero growth in employment. You know, you can see in our world today what these dissonances produce. Social contracts break down, political extremism grows, the notion that the outside is the enemy, the retreat behind national borders emerges, and much of the world into which you have planned your entire business may just cease to function the way you have known it to function. That is the complexity, that is the systems approach that is embedded in the Sustainable Development Goals in its logic of trying to address issues not in some form of chronology of development. First you develop, then you clean up, then you deal with your social and inequality challenges. No, we have to do it simultaneously. We have to reinvent our economies for a world in which sustainable consumption production will define the future viability of our economies in an economic, in a social, and an environmental sense. That is why we are so proud to be partners to a business forum such as this one, because we believe in the power of business to be a central player in shaping that world. And through the echo that we have sensed and we are increasingly engaging with of the SDGs, we also are reaffirmed in our conviction that this is a framework that allows not only nations to think together, but also businesses to think together, and businesses and government to think together, and indeed citizens to become part of the equation. It is a kind of lingua franca to talk about the choices we need to make and how we can make them together. We in UNDP are ourselves trying to adjust. As I said at the beginning, we are a big, heavy public organization that is committed to working on the front lines of development, that has to reinvent itself all the time. And my ambition also is, particularly through the interactions we have with the private sector, to allow UNDP to aspire to be the most forward-looking, the most widely networked organization in the field of development that can deliver 21st century solutions to the complex challenges that we face. The partnerships we have with leaders in the business community are increasingly an integral part of the way we think about the future, the tools we use, the platforms we deploy, and whether it is in the field of insurance, where I co-chair the International the Insurance Development Forum, whether it is in the field of finance and SDG impact investment. My colleague Elizabeth will speak to you later on a new startup that we have launched called SDG Impact. Whether it is in a partnership that we just launched a few months ago with the advertising industry, at their behest, with their initiative. A brilliantly simple idea. Advertising and marketing is a $600 billion market in the world per annum, extraordinary number. Surprisingly, animals feature prominently in a lot of advertising. So the advertising industry came up with the idea that 0.5% of the spend of advertising using an animal could be pledged towards actually investing in wildlife conservation and biodiversity and habitat protection, and thereby generate $100 million a year in additional revenue. They approached us, we provided the platform, we now have a partnership that involves some of the leading advertising companies, brand companies in the consumer products market. It is an initiative that came out of this world in which we become a partner and we enable new things to happen. Ladies and gentlemen, this was a quick journey across a spectrum of both an outlook on what is happening around us and in the future, an appreciation of how imperatives to act in human history more often than not have always triggered extraordinary ingenuity, entrepreneurship, and opportunity, and in a way relating this to the world of business through the lens of the capacity to be part of the solution, but also to understand that the markets of tomorrow will judge you by where you stand on some of these major challenges that you can call civilizational challenges, economic development challenges, whatever suits the world and the language which you use. At the end of the day, we are united by a very simple fact. 10 billion people on this planet in the year 2050 will only thrive and succeed if they collaborate and cooperate. The opposite is to try and do it by competition, by trying to put the other side down, by raising walls, by preventing people from being able to work with one another. We in the United Nations believe that we are the antithesis of that view of the world. It is a very dark view of the world. It is one that is based on division. It is one that will lead to conflict. And it is one that actually undermines our capacity to address the challenges which we face. In that spirit, what we are discussing here at the forum is also about a view of the world in 2030 that is actually working together rather than against each other. Thank you very much.